Welcome to this edition of Refined Relaxation, brought to you by Paul's Cigar Lounge. I'm Paul, this is John, and we wanted to have a special edition for the 4th of July. Talk about some things political. But before we jump into, well, some serious things, let's talk about drinks first. John, you got something prepared for me here. I see in a nice a glass of something with an apple. So tell me what I've got.
Yeah, so this tried to go a little bit what they would have during colonial times. So in a lot of the colonial taverns, they would have cocktails made with shrubs. So this is the bourbon apple. So it is apple cider shrub and bourbon whiskey. So it would be something similar to what they might get at a colonial tavern.
Yeah, a little bit sweet, but nice and balanced, and we've got a caramelized apple on top. So a delightful apple drink, and again, apple was one of the main drinks back in the day of the Revolution, and so really appropriate for 4th of July. John, what are you drinking?
Well, this is another drink that was enjoyed quite a bit in colonial times. This is port. So we know all of our founding fathers really loved their fortified wines, especially Washington and Jefferson, so this is something that they could have been drinking.
Well, fortified wines keep a little better due to the addition of brandy, as well as it increases the alcohol level, which again helps the shelf life remain a little better, and of course port is just a marvelous drink. We've got some cigars selected. I've got the Henry Clay, again appropriate. Henry Clay I know was a Speaker of the House, and so one of the only cigars we have that's actually named for a former government leader. John, what have you got smoking there?
Well, I am smoking the CAO America. So this is a barber pole that has Connecticut broadleaf and Connecticut shade. So two different tobacco wrappers grown in America. The Henry Clay was actually born right around the time of the Revolution. So he was born in 1777. So
well,
right in the midst of it.
Yep, and later went on to become, again, Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. So really an appropriate cigar for us. And of course, these Henry Clay are great cigars in the top 10 in Cigar Aficionado ratings this last year, this little Corona. So a great cigar choice there. So John, tobacco was a big part of the founding of America. So let's talk about that just a little bit. We know that the colonial days revolved around a lot of things like tobacco and alcohol, rum. Unfortunately, some not of our best days in our history, with slavery being a part of all of that. So talk to us a little bit about how tobacco and rum and liquors played into our early founding days.
Yeah, so a lot of the issues that was in the build-up to the Revolutionary War was trade and taxes. So we all kind of know about the taxes, the tea taxes that caused the Tea Party.
Sure, no taxation without representation. That was the cry of the Revolution.
And so part of that is some historians theorize that the Tea Party could have been a lot more to do with rum. Because what would happen is the Atlantic trade triangle, the British ships would pick up rum or molasses in the Caribbeans, bring them up to the colonies where they would get tobacco and fur and all of that sort of goods. And then the colonials there would use the molasses to make rum. And then the English would bring all the colonial goods back to Europe, and then eventually to Africa, where they would trade those goods for slaves. So the same tax that was on the tea was also on molasses and rum. So that
it wasn't just a drink of tea.
Right.
It was a little bit of rum as well. And we forget how big a business rum was. I mean, it was so big that they actually had a molasses vat in Boston burst and break to the point where people died. It was an amazing flood of molasses. It's an incredible story if you want to read the history of it. But that's how big rum was in America.
Yeah, and it actually, after those taxes and then with the boycotts, that's when the American continent started making whiskey. It's because they had to find something homegrown to be able to make their alcohol.
So if you couldn't use molasses, because you couldn't get it or it was taxed, you used corn and whatever else you could produce here to make your own whiskey. And what about tobacco? Was there taxes on tobacco, and how? Because tobacco was a huge crop. Tobacco being very, very popular in England and in the continent in its early days, once brought back by Sir Walter Raleigh, and both in smoke for pipes and then later cigars. Snus was very big back then. We even know about that anymore. But chewing tobacco, lots of uses for tobacco. That must have had some effect in the early days as well.
Yeah, so with tobacco, it doesn't seem like it was as much an issue with tax as it was with trade and debt. The colonies, like Washington and Jefferson, both had tobacco plantations.
Yeah, Virginia was a huge tobacco growing
Yeah.
region, and they were both, of course, Virginians.
Yeah, and so they would ship that over to England, and the kind of power imbalance kind of affected trade there. But then there's also, I guess, a little bit of a conspiracy theory that Washington and Jefferson and a lot of these other Virginia and Southern founding fathers had huge debts out to England to set up their tobacco farms. And in the late 1750s, there was actually a market collapse in tobacco. And so all of these farmers couldn't repay their loans. And so there's some theories that that kind of spurred them in the direction of splitting with England.
Imagine that. It's conspiracy theories about American presidents. Nothing new, is there? But we do know for sure that tobacco was a huge crop in the colonies. So much so in the early days of the colonies, tobacco was so lucrative that they actually had to subsidize farmers to grow food because there wasn't enough food to eat because all the farmers were making their money growing tobacco. And again, it was a huge product, particularly again for things like pipe, where we still call pipe tobacco Virginia burley. It's one of the major categories of that. And we don't think with cigars, we think of the Caribbean as where we grow tobacco, which is certainly the case. But tobacco was a huge crop for the Americas all through the middle and south of the United States. So taxing rum, taxing tea, caused that whiskey, certainly all that got resolved. We got the debt taken away. We became a free country, got rid of England. Everything was great, right?
Yeah, and then our government turned around and taxed the whiskey and caused a whole other, I guess we could call it a micro rebellion.
So the Whiskey Rebellion.
The Whiskey Rebellion of the early 1790s. And that was actually George Washington called out the militia and kind of shut it down. And
So we rebelled against our own government because of taxation as well. Go figure, government taxes, and people didn't like it. And again, no shortage of drama there because, in fact, wasn't Washington one of the largest distillers in America at one time?
Yeah.
So we think of him as and again, I always look back at history and remember that people haven't changed. That men like Washington and Jefferson, despite their renown and certainly great accomplishments, were people just like you and I. They were people who were trying to make a living, trying to raise their families, business people, again, significant business people. But again, Washington, a distiller, a plantation owner, a farmer, same with Jefferson. We kind of forget those details about our early fathers. And the fact that, yeah, there was certainly at least the potential for some conflicts of interest and for some other involvements that happened there with those politicians who were, like today, also businessmen and had interest beyond the world of politics.
That's right.
What about cigar smokers? Any of our founding fathers had cigar? And we know later presidents, everybody knows U.S. Grant, but that was Civil War. So what about the early days?
Yeah, so we talked about Henry Clay, who was born right around that time. He was obviously a big cigar smoker. A character that most of us probably aren't familiar with is General Israel Putnam, and he was one of the generals in the Continental Army. He's credited with popularizing cigars in the American continent. But some of our presidents, James Madison was a pretty avid cigar smoker, and then Andrew Jackson, who wasn't really in the Founding Fathers, but he was about 13 or 14 during the Revolution, and he was actually courier and maybe a little bit of a spy. But him and his wife, the First Lady, would smoke cigars quite a bit. It said that his wife Rachel would smoke 3 cigars before bed.
Well, as every First Lady should, and couldn't you imagine Mrs. Biden, Dr. Biden, Jill Biden, having a couple of 3 cigars every night in the White House before going to bed. Somehow just doesn't fit with today, but it was back in the day. And you think back again to those days, because Andrew Jackson was Kentuckian, was he not?
Yes.
And we know that still today is a big tobacco growing region, particularly the fire-cured tobaccos. And we have Kentucky fire-cured cigars that are popular in America.
Right, most of them made in Italy.
Yes, but we still think of those things. So again, it's interesting to see the correlations between how things were back then, how it affected cigars, how it affected our government, how the policies of the government intertwined with the lives of people, even our founding fathers and presidents, who, like the rest of us, had interests in business and agriculture as well. So we got cigars in America, and we've enjoyed them ever since, and it certainly is appropriate that we celebrate 4th of July with a cigar. Tobacco, for sure, big part of our founding fathers. So, this 4th of July, when you light up your cigar, think about James Madison and his wife having a good cigar in the White House, or the farmers like Thomas Jefferson and Washington, who raised tobacco as a part of their agricultural production, and celebrate the 4th of July in a truly American way by enjoying a little tobacco in the form of a cigar. So here, on behalf of John, all of us here at Paul's Cigar Bar, happy 4th of July, and enjoy an American treat, a cigar, as you find your refined relaxation this holiday. Cheers, John.